Yeah, yeah, yeah. Awesome. I'm sorry, I'm just moving things around. I have like two screens and Zoom is always a pain for me. Okay, I think I got it. I like to see the gallery view, so if everybody wants to. Okay, so I guess we're ready, yeah?
Let's do this. Thank you, Angel, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your knowledge and experience with us. It's all yours. I'm going to mute myself and I'll just be admitting people.
My pleasure. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I want to say thank you to everybody. Am I chopping? Am I choppy? Okay. Sorry. I just got a message that my internet connection was bad. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for showing up. I really appreciate you, spending your Friday evening listening to me talk about shiny object syndrome. So let me try this again. All right. So basically, this talk, just a quick little intro about the talk. So this talk is geared around as developers and people in the technology industry. A lot of times we're under the gun and expected to work fast, right? Deliver software as quickly as possible. It wasn't always the case, right? Where these high velocity type deadlines for software was required. When back in the day when I started developing software, the deadlines were pretty reasonable. I would say we would even sandbag managers and projects, meaning, we would say if something would take us a month, we would buffer it with like 2 weeks, right? And a lot of times we didn't have, back then we didn't have tooling like we do today, right? So that was, for me, it was a little appropriate. And as I grew in my career and things progressed and technology got faster and the cool new stuff started coming out, those deadlines started getting shorter and shorter. So we were not able to buffer things as we used to. And a lot of times, when you have those short deadlines, we were basically under the gun and we had to solve problems really quickly. And back in those days, I would say, the internet wasn't as strong as it was today for finding solutions, right? So there wasn't a lot of open source kind of code out there that would help you. And you fast forward today where you have tons of it, so much so that, you get confused often. And then you pick an object that maybe someone or a few folks are really it's really popular. A few folks are raving about. And then you come to realize really quickly once it's deployed and in production that it was a big mistake, right? And that's what I mean by shiny object syndrome, right? So if you're talking about the new hotness, then that's kind of where I'm going with shiny objects, right? And I just wanted to define that before we go into the talk. So before we go in, just a little quick intro. My name is Angel Rivera. I'm a developer advocate for CircleCI today. But before that, I used to work many, many years ago. I started my career off in the United States Air Force as an airman. And I was working for United States Air Force Space Command, which is today now U.S. Space Command. So it's a whole different, right? That's the new unit or a new military branch that they built, particularly to deal with space. But when I was working back then, it was early 90s. And I was working down in Cape Canaveral. So I was working with the space program, right? I don't know if probably some of you don't remember the shuttle program, but I was actually sitting on a scope, working in that capacity. But that's where I actually learned also how to program professionally, right? So I grew in that position. And I can tell you back then as well, right? The internet was in its infancy for the most part. And when I was developing software, I was developing software in isolation. I wasn't, there wasn't the internet like we know it today. Like I said, there wasn't a GitHub, there wasn't a Stack Overflow, right? It was straight up, you had to either know someone who knew how to solve your problem and knew the stack that you were working with, or you just had to, read the manual and figure it out on your own. So yeah, back then, software development was very challenging. And, with the advent of the internet, things got a little bit easier. So much so that, you know, we have what we have today and folks can get up and running quickly. But when I was building software, I in that environment, I would write software, you know, sitting in a cubicle on a computer, and then I would have to package it up and send it down to what we used to call, like, assist admins, and today they're called what, DevOps teams or SRE teams, right? And those are the folks that were basically operations. And, you know, I'd have to package this software up into some sort of installer program, and then, or a binary, take it, put it on a floppy disk, right? Walk it on down the hall to the data center where they had all the servers that, you know, were managed, or they were managing all the servers and resources. It wasn't like today where we have a cloud, right? Amazon, you know, you can just click 3 buttons and you have a server running. You literally had to walk it down to the data center and knock on a door. And of course it was pretty much all secure, right? So they wouldn't allow me in, because at the time, developers and operators or sysadmins, they were like oil and water, right? They just didn't mix. And a lot of times it was because you wrote some software as a developer, they deployed it to a server, and then it would crash, right? Or, you know, they had issues with it. And system administrators back then weren't as, let's say, knowledgeable as they are today with code. So, right, it was started, the blame game was going on, right? Oh, it's your software. No, it's your server. And, you know, to be fair, a lot of times it was their servers that were jacked up, or they didn't have them configured properly. But anyway, so as I was, you know, writing this code, most developers that I work with didn't really care, or didn't, yeah, they just didn't care, or didn't understand how, you know, what happened to their software after it was written. And that never really sat well with me, right? I always wanted to know, like, well, I spent all this time and effort writing this code, you know, and then I just hand it off to some stranger, and I never see anything about it, you know, hear anything about my code or see it in action until there's a problem, right? And then they haul your butt down there to try to fix it. So that's the context, right, that I was in. And then I started figuring out, like, okay, well, how do I get myself entrenched with those teams and figure out how I can, you know, see my software running. And what I did was, as I was bringing the software down, you know, to them when I was delivering it, right? Literally, that's kind of a deployment. It was a manual, literally hanging them a disk. I would kind of say, hey, let me see how you deploy it, right? And in the beginning, they were very apprehensive, like, who's this developer? No one was ever asking them to get access to this data center. But over time, right, I would fix, when I had problems with the software, I would come and help them fix the software. And again, most of the time, it wasn't my software that was buggy. It was just a configuration problem. So I started building these, like, personal relationships with folks. And over time, they started realizing, like, oh, Angel just cares about his software, is not trying to figure out, you know, what's going on in our data center. So over time, they would give me a little bit more access, right, every time, to their systems, and show me the ropes. And eventually I was at the point where I was walking this disk down and installing the software into, you know, staging environments and such. And then at that point, if it was, you know, passing all of their processes, then they would let me deploy it to production, which was really unusual. So the point here is, I started off as a developer, right, knowing nothing about the operational side of the house. But because of my curiosity and my obsession, really, about, you know, what happened to my code after, I actually started learning operational skills, right? So throughout my career, I've always had, after that, I always get hired to be a developer at companies, but because I had such deep knowledge in, you know, system administration, particularly Solaris, Unix, you know, it always ended up at different companies, even, and different organizations. If there were problems, I probably had already seen it as as a developer and as an operator. So I was able to fix things quickly. And then once people smell that sysadmin skill set on you, it's like, okay, that's the guy. You know, you kind of work both sides of the house. So just to kind of give you some context about how I came up in the software industry, it was pretty much a developer with a lot of operational skills, and you know, it's helped me throughout my career. So I that kind of story is going to lead into what I'm actually going to talk about, which is a story of when I pretty much was working a few years after, leaving the United States Air Force, working on a team with a pretty solid team, right? So we had developers, we had system admins and operators that were really skilled people. So when I joined the team, we were solid, right? Like, so we had, again, really solid developers, really solid operations teams, and there was no project really that we couldn't tackle and maintain the systems. So one of the hard parts about software development is maintaining that software over time, right? Making sure that it's running efficiently, optimized, and right. It takes a lot of coordination between development teams and operations teams. And by the way, for those of you that don't know, this is all happening before DevOps was kind of coined in a sense. So, but we were, if I were to describe the kind of synergy and the culture, we were DevOps strong for sure. So one day we got a request or a new project unloaded on us by my management. And what we were trying to do there is basically add new web UI features. And when we were adding these new web UI features, our system, the system that we were kind of upgrading or adding these features to was kind of old school. It's kind of written in an old framework, old stack. And what we wanted to do with these new features was kind of test out adding a more updated kind of stack to it, right? And what we encountered, though, was the biggest problem that we encountered was the data schema that we were using, right? So we were using a relational data model on the back end in our old legacy system. And the new features that we wanted to deploy or build on top of the legacy system was using hierarchical data models. So we had to figure out a way to take this flat 2D relational schema and then transfer it over to a hierarchical data model, which in essence is JSON, right? So that's what we're talking about here when I'm talking about hierarchical data. So the problem was, though, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to take a 2D flat relational data model, right, a data set, and then try to create hierarchies within that. It's really, really hard. There at the time, there was people who were studying it, and it required a lot of extra queries, right, on the database system, which made it really slow and inefficient. So it was very frustrating for us. Again, we had some top-notch developers and brilliant minds on the team, and we were struggling with fixing this problem. And it was so much so that, it was actually kind of demoralizing in a sense, because everything that we built, I mean, we actually had some solutions for it, but they were so hacky and slow, right? It was just bad. And no one was really comfortable with what we had built as pilots or MVPs. So I was actually working with some side. I always do, as a developer, you should always keep your skills, up to snuff, at least understand what's out there. And I always kept my skills kind of, my tools sharpened by just playing with other technologies on my off time. But one of the things that I was actually playing with during this time was MongoDB. And at the time, MongoDB was kind of very new, actually. Wasn't that fully developed, right, and not that popular. But MongoDB actually is and for those of you that don't know, MongoDB is I guess a database system. But the difference between MongoDB and like a SQL system is MongoDB is what they call non-relational. So the data actually is sitting in a format that's what they call a document model. So, and it fits, it's actually exactly like JSON, right? So that model is the same as JSON, right? So if you have a browser, and I don't know if they still use that term, but we used to do things in the browser. It's called the document object model, right? So the DOM is where this information kind of lived. So MongoDB was a database that would allow you to basically, create schemas for your data in a hierarchical model, right? So again, it's like kind of a JSON looking data set. Anyway, so I brought this idea to the team and they loved it. It was like, wow, this thing is awesome. It solves our problems, right? The data is going to be transmitted in the form that fits the model that we needed. It also sits at rest in that same model, right? So like it doesn't have to do any transformation like we had to do with the 2D relational model. So we agreed on deploying MongoDB, right? And we got started quickly on it. Our ops team started building out MongoDB infrastructures, right? Setting up clusters of servers. We started also as developers building out, well, again, we were building out the infrastructure, but we were also building out, the new features using this new hierarchical data model. The problem was that, again, remember, there was like almost zero MongoDB experience. And I was kind of the de facto expert, which I didn't know shit about MongoDB, to be honest. So I just knew what I was doing, toying around with it on my side projects. But, I figured, I'll learn it. It can't be that difficult. So we had all the systems built. The software, once we had that data model problem solved, we built the new features really, really quickly, and we were able to package it all up and then deploy it right to a staging environment. We ran some tests in regards to just making sure that the new features were functioning as per the spec. But again, we didn't do a lot of our usual testing because we were so like relieved that we found this solution. We were able to get it under, get it developed and deployed. And then we quickly, deployed it to production and released it to our users. So again, everybody was super happy, about like meeting these deadlines. The project goals were all met. And actually, I think I believe we were like 3 weeks ahead of time or a month ahead of time, which was that's always awesome, right? Like keep your own kind of deadlines. And our customers were really enjoying these features, right? They were using it. We were seeing a lot of the usage going on, and we were pretty happy with what was happening as far as like, the customers using it. So yeah, life was good, right? We were just basking in it. And right, bum, right? We get 90 days fast forward. And yeah, the MongoDB servers start kicking off, alerts and failures, and all hell's breaking loose on the system. And yeah, so our customers were experiencing failures, right? Our performance is declining. The CPUs are all pegged. We also had high disk thrashing on the servers, which is a bad thing. And yeah, like I said, we were a really tight knit group, and we were pretty spot on about confident about our team. We jumped into troubleshooting mode as one does, and yeah, once we started looking, at the problem to figure out what was going on with the system, we quickly found out exactly what was going on. The system or the users were using the program or the app, the new features so much so that they generated over 15 million documents or records, right, in the MongoDB database. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, it's a database. Shouldn't it be able to handle way more than that? And yes, this is true. It should be. But when we start digging deeper in and peeling back the layers of that onion of the problem, we definitely found that the biggest problem that the system was experiencing was I had written some really, really bad queries, right? So I was, not understanding what the queries that I wrote were the ones causing the bottleneck, right? So I wasn't indexing on the right keys, and I built an inept data schema. So let me explain what happened here. So if you're looking at the screen the stuff behind the screen to the left, that's a 2D model, right? So that's what I was kind of, what our system had before. And then to the right is the kind of JSON or hierarchical data that I was trying to recreate. The problem is with MongoDB, it's a non-relational system, right? So what I had done in MongoDB was try to create a relational system within a non-relational database system. Don't do that, right? Non-relational means you can't create relationships that way. So from the start, right, we had already failed, or I had already failed modeling this data. in the system. And that's what was causing the problem. One of the major problems was, when you're creating links in a non-relational system, you're just slowing the system even more, right? So that's kind of where the Inept schema kind of really got us in the end. So we were quickly figured out what was going on with the system. So we just did some simple math, right? So we wanted to recover the system really, really quickly so that our customers would not be, impacted so badly. And what we did was, luckily, our system the features that we built, the users really didn't care about like older things. So it was almost like a real-time system. So they only cared about the most recent records, right? Like I think it was a 24-hour period. So what we did was we just did some simple math and said, all right, well, at 15 million records, this thing took a dump, right? So we basically took and temporarily removed or reallocated those records into a different collection, which wasn't being queried at all, right? And as soon as we started moving that data, the system itself, it kind of recovered by itself, right? Again, because there was so much volume in that data and my queries were so bad, it didn't really impact anything until like I said, 90 days later, right? So the system started accruing more and more volume of data. Anyway, so in order to recover that, we just moved those data sets over to a different collection where it wasn't being queried. And again, the system recovered. But the problem was the damage was already done, right? Our customers had experienced an outage, had bad experiences, right? They lost some money and time. Our organization as well, right? We lost time and money, which is never a good thing. And yeah, the one of the biggest pain points for us though was that we kind of lost our street cred, right? It was a demoralizing situation for sure, especially as a team, right? So we were always so, like I said, we prided ourselves on being a top-notch team and very professional, and we had failed. So I don't know if you probably don't know this term, but a post-mortem or a hotwash is what we do, what usually happens after an incident or an outage, right? So teams will come together after they fix a problem and identify what happened. So that's what a hotwash is. In the military, we use that for post-operations terminology. So anyway, we performed the post-mortem. And in that post-mortem, obviously, right, the main things that we figured out were there was some bad programming, not just me, but I was responsible more for the queries. But there was we could have done a better job at some of the programming that we did to handle some of these problems. We also, this was a really nasty one. We neglected to test. So what we did was, I don't know if I told you, if you remember my story, we were like so under pressure, right? And when this shiny new thing, MongoDB, came along and saved us, we didn't even really bother to understand it, right? So we just deployed it and we didn't even need to do our normal testing, right? So this team has standard operating procedures. We prided ourselves on keeping those things maintained and operating that, and we didn't do any of it, right? We were so cocky that we were like, we'll just deploy it and it'll be fine, right? We were just, again, it's kind of a culture thing, but we were cocky and we assumed that this thing would work and would be no problem. So the other part that we figured out was we, again, didn't properly vet the MongoDB system. It wasn't MongoDB's fault that, that I created these really nasty, gnarly, ugly data models, right? That shouldn't have worked in the system. So yeah, it was basically, we didn't have a deep understanding of the technologies that we were implementing. We didn't understand its capabilities, right? And yeah, that again was one of the major contributing factors to that outage and where it bit us. So again, MongoDB wasn't the problem here. It was pretty much our mentality, right, and our neglect of our standard operating procedures and processes that kind of are supposed to protect us. Because had we performed all of that stuff, we would have detected, if we would have run a performance test or a load test on that system, we would have detected this issue right away, or at least in the preliminary stages of the project, and we could have addressed those bugs and those issues right away. And again, that's where that shiny object, right? MongoDB was our shiny object in that story. Let me grab a quick sip. So, right, yeah. So what I'm going to talk about next is avoiding the shiny object syndrome. And yeah, I'm going to kind of switch it up a little bit here and talk about things, that you can do as a developer and as an operator, if you're in that field, or a DevOps engineer, whatever your title is, to avoid kind of that shiny object syndrome. So first things first, right? Don't believe the hype. This is one of my, I love Flavor Flav, so I always like this term, because what happens is, this wasn't a failure of technology, it was a failure of humans and culture. So remember when I was saying, yeah, we were a solid team, right? Everybody's super experienced. We had some pretty badass developers, pretty badass system admins. And we started believing our own hype, right? We started assuming that everyone else was kind of taking control of their own domain. And, in DevOps culture, there is such a thing, and this is proof of it, that when you have a strong culture and everyone's super great at their jobs, you can actually have you can be too good at your job, is what I'm trying to say, right? So yeah, there's a culture, you can have too good of a culture where people start getting complacent and again start assuming, and the communications kind of break down, and again, you can be successful up to a point, but on the same token, if you start seeing, I would say my recommendation is, if you start seeing people on your team trying to kind of be a little too cocky and kind of cutting corners on things, keep an eye on that, right? Because that's super important, because that will lead you down the road where I was a few years ago with our project. So yeah, don't believe your own hype, right? Like, keep an eye on that, keep yourself centered, and understand your limitations, right? Yeah, obviously thoroughly vet these technologies, right? Have a deep understanding of the capabilities of the tooling and the stacks that you're using. Again, we're expected to write software at a super high pace these days. And a lot of that's done through automation, right? But on the same token, we're actually the ones, right? The developers and the operators are the ones, kind of implementing these things. And if you don't have a deep understanding of this technology and how it works, you're definitely going to run into, really rough patches, and they could be super impactful to your career, to the point, right, where you and your team could be fired, right? If the damage is really impactful. So yeah, understand the technologies that you're intending to use or going to use. And I would suggest that you run it through the ringer, right? Perform as many tests on these systems as you can. And if you don't understand it, or if there's no support for it, right? Sometimes companies will support that stuff. But I would say in general, if there's some light support on this stuff, I would stay away, or at least try to understand what kind of levels of support you can get from either the vendor, or if it's an open source project, right? Sometimes the communities in open source projects are really, really good, and there's tons of information, tons of help. But if there isn't, then yeah, it might not be a good idea to implement these technologies. And sometimes they're a little immature as well, right? But I would never tell anyone not to use something new. Always look at it, right? But you definitely need to have that understanding before implementing. This is really important, right? This is one of the other reasons why we got bit in the butt with that project, was we broke our own protocols, right? So what I mean by is a standard operating procedures. Companies these days require pretty much everyone, right? So if you're a startup and you're dealing with like Google or Amazon or any of the big boys or big dog companies, you basically have to have some sort of protocol written down, meaning like how you build your software, right? How do you handle failures, outages, things like that. In the real world, especially nowadays, when I was coming up, it wasn't that important, right? Companies had a little bit more they were a little bit more flexible. But today, especially if you're working with, let's say, financial industry, healthcare, any kind of government, you need to provide these, what do we call, standard operating procedures, right? So that they can understand that, look, we're dealing with a vendor, which would be your startup, and they want to make sure that you have some formal liability type documents around, right? So the disaster recovery is one, right? So if they're using your system in their business, right, you can, if you have a failure or an outage like that, you can impact their business and they'll lose money because of you. Right. So again, if you're working with big companies and you're starting out on a team, you definitely want to start developing standard operating procedures. And if you don't have them, make them, right? Like, don't, they don't have to be super detailed, right? I would say at a minimum, start like just documenting. As developers, we hate to document. I know I'm not a big fan, but I also know the value of that documentation, right? So you could either, have comments in your code or and then have a generator to generate documents based off of that. There's a lot of tooling out there that does that. But I would also start and advise folks, especially now with the way that kind of DevOps is kind of taking, it's a storm, right? Taking over the industry. I would start codifying things. Like, let's say, you have a deployment mechanism or a CI/CD pipeline. Was the company I work for, that's what we do, is CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery. Definitely write down, how you do things, even if it's like just, bullet statements and with commands or something. And if you want to take it a step further, you could even put codify things by putting it into something like, let's say if you're deploying infrastructure into clouds, you could use something like Terraform or Pulumi, right? Again, it's just something that you need to kind of have for consistency as well. So if you bring new people onto your team, now you have this documentation, right, based on how you operate, and they can easily, read through this code or these documents and learn your business, learn how you develop software on your teams. This is really, really important, and I can't stress enough how much this has actually saved me, tons of time to kind of ramping up on new teams and new jobs. Yeah, one of the things that bit us as well is we had a set it and forget it mentality, whereas we just stood everything up. We monitored it for a few days, and since it was operating fine for the first 90 days, we kind of forgot about it, right? And again, that went against pretty much everything that our team stood for. But it was just more of a culture thing. We got into this nasty bit where we were so cocky and confident that we kind of just let it ride. And yeah, it was pretty bad. So don't do that, right? Set it and forget it, no good. And I just want to stress again that, technology is all about people, right? And when you have people involved, you start forming cultures. And cultures are basically the way that we operate amongst ourselves. It sets mindsets, right? And goals. It also helps with, just basically operating more efficiently. And cultures are really important on teams and within organizations. So having said that, I'm going to switch it up a little bit and talk about more of the people skills, right, that we all could, I guess, learn about and also improve on. And I want to talk about, let's start with managers, right, because we all kind of don't like managers, or they're kind of crappy sometimes. I've been lucky. I've had a few cool managers, but I want to talk about some managerial skills that, we could all kind of learn about and even implement. So I started off my career, like I said, in the Air Force, right? So I was pretty much told to do everything, and I had to do it in a certain way, otherwise, right, big trouble. And that's just the nature of that culture, right? So the military culture is about giving orders, right, and then following orders to the letter, right? No deviation, unless you're in some sort of combat situation, right? Then you're pretty much gotta fend for yourself. But at the end of the day, when I went through that military culture, right, I didn't like it. It wasn't for me. I didn't feel like it was conducive to my personality. And when I started managing people later on in life, I always told myself, I'm not going to manage my people like the military managed me, right? So I developed this, what I call management style, what I call sudo management. And that's basically where I, would come in and talk to my teammates coming cold, right, to a new job. And I would tell them, look, I am a resource. I am a peer, right? Even though I hold the title of manager, you all know that I'm responsible for what happens on this team. And what I was trying to do there was basically, knock down these intimidation barriers that we all have with the term management, right? And people that are kind of in authority at our organizations or on our teams. And so I told them, I said, look, we're going to do a sudo style management where, I am a peer, I'm a resource. So I work hand in hand on the day to day, side by side with them, right? And I was responsible for tasks that we were doing, right, in our development. But when I had to deal with, manager type tasks, then I would tell them, hey, I'm going to sudo up and, take care of some budget things or resolve some conflict resolution, HR things, right? All these manager things that I was responsible for as well. And then I would tell them, hey, all right, all that stuff's done. I'm exiting gracefully, right? And then start working as a peer again. So again, that was my kind of way of letting them know that I'm trying to, knock down these intimidation barriers so that they can express themselves freely. They can be empowered to make decisions. And that really kind of started giving them a sense of trust, right, between us. So we built that relationship based on a positive note, and them understanding that I was pretty much there again as a peer, so that they could also grow, right? Because it's really important. When you want to grow leaders, you have to empower them. Otherwise, they're just going to be, intimidated and not kind of grow in positions. So that's sudo management. And again, as managers, right, this is my opinion, but and I think it's proven, we need to empower our subordinates or our teammates, right? And what I mean by empowering is, encourage them to take on decision-making processes on their own. Give them the ability to make mistakes, right? Because that's really important. We, like I said earlier, we learn from our mistakes. But if you have a manager that's going to hold you accountable for every mistake, right, that's a problem. That's not growth. You're not going to see any growth at all. So when you have folks, you're responsible for everything that happens on a project as a manager, but you also need to, foster a culture where people can be empowered and not be afraid to make decisions, good, bad, or indifferent, right? They need to be empowered. So yeah, that's a big one for me and I can tell you from experience that by building or facilitating a culture of empowerment, a lot of innovation starts happening, right? People are not afraid to share their ideas, and they even start owning things on their own, right? And they're really proud of these projects that they kind of conceptualized and innovated on. So yeah, there's some byproducts to this empowerment type culture that I didn't even really expect, right? So yeah, definitely have a culture of empowerment. And again, right, this is really, of all of it, this is one of the most important things. Always embrace failure, no matter how nasty and bad it is. Embrace it, figure out what happened. Don't blame anybody specifically, right? Try to keep it as, when a team fails, the whole team fails. Yeah, there's going to be a reason, and there'll definitely be people who caused the failure. But at the end of the day, I think if we all embrace this failure and we try to figure out what the hell happened, and try to uncover the root causes of that failure, then you're going to be a stronger and better team for it. Because let's say, yeah, it was maybe I deployed some code that was nasty and it caused the problem, right? Like my data model. My team wasn't like, oh, it's Angel's fault, right? We all felt the failure. And when we started doing that postmortem or Hotwash, we figured out what was going on, right? All together. And we learned from that. And then, right, we quickly were able to resolve the situation. And then afterwards, what was the learning? The other learning was, yeah, Angel caused the problem, but Angel also needed to train himself on right, non-relational data models. So I actually it was a benefit for me. I learned about how to properly, you know, model this data using that system, and so did the rest of my team, right? So again, you know, embracing failures as managers, it's painful, right? And sometimes some failures are going to be really, really bad. And yeah, you know what? You may even get fired, but at the end of the day, if that happens at an organization, I think I would say, for me at least, it's always been a good thing, right? If you get fired from a place that doesn't understand how to embrace failure, I think, you know, it's a sign for you to move on. I know it's not always a good thing, and I don't encourage everyone to get fired, but sometimes it happens, and that's okay too. So as managers, yeah, we should always foster a culture of mentorship, right? So that means going and you know, establishing kind of I would say events or even meetings, right, with maybe your junior devs or people who are interested in learning more about technology or growing their skills. Definitely have some sort of program in place for them to do that. And again, right, if you knock down those intimidation barriers, people are, and you're welcoming to folks, and you know, let them know, hey, I'm here for you as a resource. Definitely, you know, give them advice. But of course, right, we're all humans, and mentors are not, just because a mentor one person has told you something doesn't mean it's gold, right? You should always, I always say with mentors, you should do it like a doctor, right? You go and get a second opinion from another mentor, because then you have kind of, you know, these different opinions, and sometimes they won't agree, right? Or they're yeah, two different opposing opinions, and then you're going to have to be left with kind of maybe going to a third mentor. But you want to figure this stuff out, and I think it's really super important that you know, as managers, we have to be there for subordinates and our teammates. Also as managers, right? Let's talk about this. This is a really hard one, but we have to make choices. We always need to, you know, progress in whatever we do with our teams. And sometimes we're going to have like basically folks that are not cutting the muster, and no matter how much you've mentored them, how much you know, training you've given them, a lot of times folks just aren't cut for the job. And what I mean by that is sometimes it's a maybe they're not passionate about it, maybe they've kind of run their course, right? It's happened to me a few times where I was working on a team that I really, really loved the people, but the work was just so boring, right? And I had to move on. And you know, managers, I've actually had to cut people from teams, right? Because they just weren't working out. Of course, you know, I always tried to help, you know, get them either on another team, transfer to another team, or help them find another opportunity somewhere else. But making those hard choices, it's really difficult because, again, you know, we're humans, we build relationships. But on the same token, we also have to be ready to, you know, make these hard choices and decisions. And that, this, by the way, doesn't just reflect on employees or folks who, you know, are not performing well. This is also for like technology decisions as well. Sometimes indecisiveness, right? I've worked for managers that were like really hesitant to make a decision because they were afraid, again, right, to be fired or failing. So again, you know, as a manager, keep that in the back of your head. I for one, I like to make choices, go stick with them. And, you know, you always need to iterate as well and say, all right, at this, you know, if you make a choice and you're, let's say, 3/4 or a quarter of the way through some process, and you realize right away, like, oh, this isn't working. That's a pivot, you know, and adapt to change that decision. And then hopefully that'll get you where you need to be to succeed. Yeah, all right. So now we bagged on managers, or at least I bagged on managers. Let's talk about what we could do as individuals, and some of the skill sets that, you know, we could either learn or improve on. So if you're an individual working on a team, or at least in my team, and I would hear this come out of your mouth, that would not be a good conversation post, because I don't believe that folks should have that mentality, especially when you're on a team. I believe that, you know, we should all aspire to at least lead initiatives and be decisive and offer up as many opinions and ideas as possible, because that's what leadership is, right? So if you're shy, that's one thing. I think there's ways to get around that. And why are we shy as humans? Is because we don't really trust the people that we are with to either not think of our ideas as great, or we're embarrassed about ideas. I worked with tons of folks that used to say, I'm not a manager, so but they really cared, right? I think the culture was not that great where we were working, so a lot of folks would just use this term to kind of shed off any kind of responsibility. But I can tell you, if you're on a team, you are a leader, and you should think of yourself as one, and own your decisions and your projects. Yeah, working with a ton of developers, a lot of times they'll, like, let's say a code review, right? If there's something broke, they usually just say, hey, this is broken, and then move on, right? So like lately, I guess GitHub is the thing that we use these days, or some ticket tooling system. I would see these comments and it would infuriate me, because it's like, look, you're a developer, it's broken, and you obviously know how to fix it, but you just say this is broken and move on without offering solutions. That's terrible, right? For me, that's inconsiderate. As a teammate, at a minimum, if you find a problem, go ahead and offer up a recommendation. Even if you don't think it's the solid one, I think you just give it, put yourself out there. Don't be afraid to offer up your suggestions, because maybe you're half right? And maybe some other person will go, oh yeah, you're right, but this other piece, right? So like at the end of the day, you can spark someone else's kind of solution solving skills in their mind, right? Don't be afraid to go ahead and fix things. Again, it's considerate, and just again, it will help in that whole resolution process. Yeah, so let me Google that for you. That is a term I used to use quite a bit. And this is referring to more of the mentee mentality. So I talked about mentors. You should also, as mentees, right, be mindful of your mentor's time. They also have work to do, right? And one of the main things I've seen go wrong with mentors is a mentee will come and ask them about, maybe a topic, and then they'll just go into explaining it, and then even showing it, right? And then even doing their work sometimes for them. I will never do that. My first question is always, okay, so did you do some research? And a lot of times I hear no, and then I'll go, well, yeah, go research it for 20 minutes. And if you still have an issue, come back to me, right? Otherwise, you'll get one of these, let me Google that for you, from me. And, that's what as a mentee, you should be doing up front, right? Before you even go to the mentor, try to learn, because as a developer, we're going to be learning pretty much the rest of our careers, right? That's what this job is. I always say it's like 90% learning, and the other 10% is everything else, right? So keep that in mind when you're a mentee, right? And respect the mentor's time, because again, this is about you learning, not them. And the other piece to that is, don't spend too much time either. I have a 20-minute rule that I tell my mentees, like, look, I need you to look at it for at least 20 minutes. And after that 20 minutes, come talk to me, and let's, we'll educate you, or at least try to. I've had the mentees come ask me, and then I tell them, did you research it? They walk away, and a week later, they've spent pretty much the whole week being unproductive, looking up that silly one thing not silly, I shouldn't say that one issue that they were trying to figure out. And, I could have educated them in that after 20 minutes. So it can go either way, right? Like, try to keep it within a 20-minute range, 30-minute range, but don't take like a week, right? That's like 80 hours that you were pondering how to, solve a problem. Yeah. This is one I struggle with, being from New Jersey, right? We're like a fast-paced breed. I don't know where everyone is from on the meetup here, but yeah, if you go out into like the Midwest or the South, or other regions in the country, actually outside of this northeastern region, people are a lot slower. And I don't mean that in a mentality state. I just mean it. They just move at a different pace than we do. So yeah, I had to learn that over time, and I still struggle with it. Where I'm sitting in meetings, and maybe someone starts talking about a problem, and I've already lived that problem, right? So I want to jump in and tell them the solution, but I have to, like this guy's in here holding my hand over my mouth, because you have to let people kind of let themselves express themselves, and especially when you're trying to fix problems, and then let them talk it through. Because I can tell you, I've interrupted folks, and it's, number one, it's rude, and number two, you're not really letting them kind of process the problem. And what I've done is, in my career now, I just try to shut up. And it's really hard, because I want to, like, help them quickly, but I would recommend that you just sit back, let them express themselves, and then you can, reply. And a lot of times what happens there is, for me at least, they actually, when they're talking through their problem, they actually start, you see, like, I would say the light bulb goes off when they're talking about it. Then they realize what's causing the problem, and they have a solution. And then they go, oh yeah, I could have just fixed it with that, and I didn't even have to say anything, right? And most of the time it's the right answer. So again, right, I would recommend learning how to, and again, I struggle with it, but learn how to listen. And then also, keep continually, I guess, training yourself to be a better listener, right? And you can learn from a lot of folks in meetings. Sometimes there's people that are super great listeners, and you can learn from them just by watching, right? And then the other skill is communication. Listening and communicating for me, are two different things. Communication is again, right, the interaction that you're having. So you're expressing your ideas, and then you're also listening to ideas. So it's a little bit of both communication. And we definitely need to, at least I struggle with this as well, or at least I always aspire to learn new skills in communication. And right, there's so many forms of communication. One of the pitfalls I will kind of share with you all is, when you're reading like texts, right? Any kind of text, don't elicit emotion. That's one thing that I think we all kind of struggle with that. Emoticons or emojis have helped with that these days, because you can kind of say, hey, I say something really that could be construed different ways, right? But if you have a smiley face behind it, it's not negative, it's positive, right? But one other piece of advice that I learned over time is, if you're an individual and you're having maybe a conversation with folks over email, and you're not using emojis, right? Again, don't elicit emotion. But if you're going back and forth, right, in this email, and it's kind of it feels like you might feel like it's getting heated, just pick up the phone, call the person, right, and have a verbal conversation. Because by verbally communicating, you're able to hear tones, right, in the voice. And then if you're communicating with me, depending on how I'm feeling, it could sound really nasty, right? Invite me to a coffee, or invite that person to a coffee, and then you could see, pretty much gauge the situation, and then you'll be able to kind of resolve it, right? De-escalation if it's required. But most of the time, when you're reading text, it's just you're kind of projecting your emotion. That's what happens to me a lot. I'm in a bad mood, and I'm reading this like email, and I'm thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Meanwhile, it's me. I'm in the bad mood. And then I call them up, and they're like, what's wrong with you? I was totally just asking you about something, there was no emotion involved. So yeah, communication skills, definitely, work on those, and try to improve where you can. So in closing, tech problems, again, are not tech problems, right? And again, most of these issues that I described, including the story I told you about, our technology failure, is all related to culture. And one thing I will ask, the world today, we are in weird space right now. What's happening, especially with COVID-19, and how even like before COVID, how companies are transforming. If you read a lot of blogs like I do in technology, look at what's happening. They're mainly talking about these DevOps culture shifts, or right. DevOps isn't about necessarily about the technology. It's about how companies and teams are changing their culture so that it's more of a people first approach, right? So they're realizing like, look, technology is about people, so we need to keep our people in a good mindset, right? In a good and keep them thinking and learning. And that's where like the culture piece comes. So what I ask is, moving forward, let's build some better cultures, right? When you go out to do your job, or if you're in college and you're going to get a job, which you will, yeah, think about the things I've kind of mentioned today, and yeah, keep that in the back of your mind. I think throughout your career, I think you'll be super successful with that. And I think that is it. Yeah, that's it. So I can take some questions if you're, are we up for that? Or I can't hear anyone.
Questions, anybody? Very talkative
Oh,
tonight.
we're chatting. Well, yeah. Yeah, don't be shy.
It's all
I
good.
know
It's
there's
just
one
us.
out there.
Would you feel more comfortable if we pause recording for questions?
Yeah, we could do that.